Introduction. Livy was born at Padua in 59 BC, 10 years before Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon, and the beginning of the struggle which brought the end of the Republic in Rome. He died in AD 17, when the Emperor Tiberius had been 3 years on the throne. Though by birth a provincial, he spent most of his life, an uneventful one, in an eventful age, in the capital occupied, exclusively, so far as we know, in literary work. As a young man, he wrote philosophical dialogues, which have not survived and are probably, to judge by the general temper of his mind, no great loss. He began his history of Rome from its foundation about the year 26 BC. The date is fixed with very fair certainty by the reference on page 31 of this volume to the closing of the Temple of Janus, and continued to work at it for the remaining 40 years of his life. The history consisted of 142 books, i.e., about 28 volumes of the size of this one, a long work. Martial called him Huge Livy, an epithet which needed no great inventive capacity. Of the whole, however, only about 1/4 now survives, though we have brief summaries of the contents of the rest. Classical scholars, for the most part, lament the lost 3/4, but as a very distinguished one whispered to me some years ago how terrible it would be if all the lost books were suddenly found. I do not think he meant it in a derogatory sense. More likely he was suggesting a particular small satisfaction enjoyed by students of the classics. Their knowledge, namely, that the text, at any rate, though not the discoveries of the archaeologists, are limited. After all, there is comparatively little Greek or Latin literature, and it doesn't grow. A man can know it, more or less, and is not required, as the student of modern literature is, to pant along forever in the hopeless effort to keep up to date. Literature and the other arts did not come naturally to the ancient Italians, as they did to the ancient Greeks. They were a forced growth. Literary Latin is a noble instrument, but even in the best writers it bears the traces of its manufacturer. Its movement is the movement of a machine, however precise and delicate, while the movement of the best Greek is that of a living organism. Greek writers had style. Latin writers had a style, each his own, which is a very different thing. They knew that art was to conceal art. But could not act up to that excellent dictum. Even the most successful of them seems to be trying to show the reader how artful he is, as perhaps, to take an English parallel, did Walter Pater or Carlyle. There are exceptions to this apparent artfulness. Catullus, for instance, amongst the poets, and Caesar and Petronius amongst the prose writers. Pretty well, all the rest are tarred with the same brush, even Virgil. Perhaps especially Virgil, though in him the artfulness is so triumphant that one bows to it in humility and gratitude. When Livy wrote, Latin literature had reached its culmination. Virgil and Horace were his elder contemporaries. Caesar was murdered when Livy was a boy of 15. Cicero a year later. Sallust, the first Roman historian to base his work on independent research, had died not long before. After Livy, only one writer in the great classical tradition, the historian Tacitus, was still to come. The old republic was gone forever. The agonies of 50 years of civil war, with its fierce personal rivalries, its massacres and proscriptions and pogroms, as savage and almost as wholesale as those of our modern world, were already a memory. Tranquility had come again, but at the price of freedom, whatever that difficult world may mean. Livy accepted the situation. Indeed, he had to, like poor Jane Nightwork, who could not choose but be old. He was by nature a recluse, mild in temperament, and, one guesses, constitutionally averse to violence. The restoration of peace gave him the opportunity he wanted to turn all the imaginative passion of his mind, of which it had much, to the legendary and historical past of the country he loved, and to draw from that great story a salutary lesson which he hoped would be taken to heart by his degenerate contemporaries. On that task he lavished, over a period of 40 years, all the resources of his mind and heart. I do not know if it is proper for a translator to air his difficulties in a preface. I have said something of what seems to me a characteristic of Latin writing in general, and in Livy that characteristic is strongly marked. Livy is a stylist, a conscious stylist. Plato was not, in spite of the story that he rewrote 70 times the first sentence of the Republic. In Livy, one sees the process at work. One watches the delicate wheels turning. The hair-spring pulsing follows admiringly the intricately balanced clauses, waits for the clenching word, and sighs with satisfaction when at last, in the inevitable place, out it comes. Pop! Like the rabbit from the conjurer's hat. How good it is, and how Latin! His language, too, is richly imaginative. The mad Emperor Caligula, if we may believe his biographer, Suetonius, called Livy verbose. But he was not that. A better critic, Quintilian, spoke of his milky plenitude, a disagreeable phrase, but nearer the truth. In English criticism, the words opulent and coloured have often been used, very properly, to describe him. Well, what is his translator to do about all this? Is he, in order to be faithful, to try to reproduce those intricately balanced clauses that colour that opulence and milky plenitude? Not in my belief, unless he is a fool. Much nonsense has been talked about the art of translation. Translators have claimed to reproduce the spirit of their original, i.e., the subtlest, inmost essence of his style. It cannot be done. That subtlest essence lies within the words themselves. Change the words, and it, too, is inevitably changed. Other translators have professed to write as they suppose their original would have written had he been their contemporary and used their language. This is absurd. If Livy, say, were alive today, and an Englishman, every influence which went to make his style, and there are millions such for every writer, would be utterly different from what it was. No, style is too serious a thing to monkey with, or to make pretenses about. To try to imitate another man's style, even the style of a man next door, makes false writing. To try to imitate the style of a foreign author who has been dead 2,000 years is plain silly. The truth is that every writer, whether he is translating or not, can write in only one style only, his own. I have endeavoured to understand always Livy's precise meaning and to express it as clearly as I could. But in the following pages, milky plenitude is, I fear, conspicuously absent. Livy was an admired and popular writer in his own lifetime, and made his reputation long before his 142nd book was published. The Emperor Augustus seems to have liked him personally and certainly admired his work, chaffing him on one occasion for being a Pompeian, i.e., for supporting the Republican side against Caesar in the Civil War, but without resentment. There is a story that a Spaniard traveled from Cadiz to Rome for the sole purpose of seeing the great historian, and having seen him, and apparently nothing else, traveled back again, well pleased. Meanwhile, Livy went on writing that became a habit, as he tells us himself, and if he paused, he felt uncomfortable. When he died, he had brought his story from the earliest and legendary days of Rome down to the year 9 BC. Had the gods granted him more years of life, he would presumably have progressed further, for his history, not being the history of a particular period or movement or phase or set of ideas, had no foreseeable end imposed by artistic necessity, and a unity which the work has is a unity not of form but of tone and temper only. Though in the present volume the curtain does indeed come down with a fine dramatic flourish on the capture of Rome by the Gauls, and Camillus's great speech persuading his countrymen not to abandon their ruined city. Modern scholars, having the results of other scholars' researches readily available in libraries, are fond, perhaps too fond, of dwelling upon Livy's inaccuracy as a historian. Accuracy is doubtless a valuable quality in historical writing, and it is not difficult to point to instances in which Livy fell short of it. When he finds that his authorities, previous annalists, now no more than names, disagree, he chooses between them capriciously. Sometimes the account he accepts is the oldest, sometimes the most likely, as he calls it, sometimes the one which best illustrates the general view which he is concerned to present of Roman development and decay. He is excessively vague about numbers. He understood little or nothing about the practical business of war, and appears never to have visited the site of any of the battles he describes. Indeed, had he done so, he might not have been much the wiser, as he was by nature a contemplative, a cloistered student, to whom the doings of men were interesting not, as they were, for instance, to Herodotus, in their bright immediacy, but only in their broad moral significance. He had no practical experience of politics, and little interest in them as such. The political struggles of the early ages of Rome he uses with great effect to illustrate his conception of such abstract qualities as liberty and patriotism, but never sees them from the inside as the oldest, most perennial, and most absorbing of all the rough games invented by men for their amusement and satisfaction. He several times mentions certain records which he calls the linen rolls, but never seems to have bothered to consult them personally. Discussing, in Book 4, whether Cossus was cavalry officer or consul when he won the spoils of honor from Tolumnius of Veii, he says that the Emperor Augustus entered the shrine of Jupiter Feretrius before its restoration, and told him that he had read the inscription on Cossus's breastplate, which had been deposited there. He did not, however, trouble to verify this fact himself. He is not interested in original documents. He mentions on page 39 of this volume a long metrical formula, which was anciently used to solemnize a compact between states, but adds that it is not worth the trouble of quoting, and there is a similar instance in a later book, not in this volume, where he omits to quote an important document of early Latin, Andronicus's hymn to Juno, because, as he remarks, it would seem crude to his cultivated readers. One could extend the list, scolding him, for instance, for not making use of the archaeological researches of Varro, which were readily available to him, or for his occasional and always unfortunate departures from the highly trustworthy narrative of Polybius, when he came to describe the Hannibalic and Macedonian wars. All this cannot be gainsaid, and we must admit that Livy was far from being a scientific historian. A graver charge than negligence and inaccuracy would be the deliberate falsification of fact, and this charge has been brought against Livy by Mr. Robert Graves in an essay about the relationship between Rome and the Etruscans. Etruscology is one of the learned bees that buzzed delightfully in Mr. Graves' bonnet, and he assures us that Livy got the story wrong, either deliberately or perhaps unconsciously, as a part of the general Roman conspiracy of silence about his painful interlude in Rome's otherwise steady process in conquest and expansion. According to Mr. Graves, the Etruscans conquered and captured Rome, which remained under their dominion for a century, when they were expelled again by a rising of the native population. In subsequent years, every effort was made by Rome to obliterate the traces of this defeat, and to pretend that it never happened. And so successfully that little is certainly known even today about this able and interesting nation. Their literature has vanished. The few surviving inscriptions cannot be interpreted with certainty. Even their origin is a matter of dispute among scholars, all of which is precisely what the Romans aimed at and achieved. Was Livy a party to this process of deliberate mystification, or did he take the tradition as he found it, without any attempt either to corroborate or to undermine it by independent research? The latter seems the more likely. It is clear, then, that Livy's history, as a record of fact, must be taken with a certain wariness. Again, though he has a strong sense of character, Livy's sense of the past is weak, and he tends to interpret ancient history too much in the light of modern ideas. He gets his proportions wrong, for instance. In writing of the very early days, he insists upon describing some miserable squabble between what must have been, in effect, rival villages as a war, with all the pomp and circumstance of victory and defeat, and a plethora of detail either invented or lifted wholesale from a previous annalist. The cumulative effect of these wars may add dignity to his tale, but it is hardly history. Nevertheless, when this has been said, the fact remains that Livy has written an admirable book, amusing, instructive, heartwarming, and with a nobility of its own. Few modern readers, coming to it for the first time, will wholly fail to understand the feelings of the nameless Spaniard who walked so far simply to see the face of the man who wrote it. The secret of its power is the quality of Livy's vision, passionate, deeply romantic, innocent. Rome was a mighty nation, but the Romans were not an amiable or attractive people. And their history, at any rate, from the defeat of Hannibal to the final overthrow of the Republic, was in many ways squalid and brutal enough. But no nation grows great without great virtues, and it was those virtues, fair dealing, integrity, the fear of God, political competence, as opposed to the Greeks, who in this field thought of everything but accomplished nothing, and above all, a devoted patriotism, which gave Livy his inspiration. He could not have imagined them if they had not been real, however deeply overlaid by the collapse of the old institutions, the vulgar luxury, the awful chasm between rich and poor, and the bloody and anarchic struggles for power throughout Livy's childhood, and the generation before he was born. No doubt he idealizes the past, and willingly, in the early books contained in this volume, confounds legend with history. But that is an essential part of his purpose. For though he followed the old annalist, he was not himself primarily an annalist, but an interpreter. And the truth of his history is, as many have pointed out, akin to the truth of poetry. Perhaps all history, which rises above the yearbook level, is, in a greater or lesser degree, akin to poetry. The Roman critic Quintilian thought it to be so, basing his judgment on the need of every historian to select from the multitude of facts only those which will serve as props for his vision of a truth which goes beyond them. The best historians are creators as well as recorders. What Livy created is a vision of the old Roman Republic, already dead when he was born. A vision a little larger than life, a little simpler and more austere, but nonetheless valid and compelling. The imaginative truth of his vision was recognized at once by his contemporaries, and it has continued to be recognized ever since. In this, perhaps, he is worthy to touch with a finger the hem of the garment of his great contemporary, Virgil, who also sang the greatness of Rome, but with deeper passion and a far subtler, more universal sense of the glories and glooms of human destiny, and the transience of mortal things. It is fashionable nowadays to divorce art from morality, and to look askance at the artist who does not trouble, or has not the skill to conceal the lesson he would teach. The ancients, and indeed the moderns up to a century or two ago, were more naive in this matter. They made no bones about their desire to instruct. Livy was not an exception. He was an earnest moralist, and believed that if history were not morally instructive, it was nothing. History, he writes in his preface, is the best medicine for a sick mind. For in history you have a record of the infinite variety of human experience plainly set out for all to see, and in that record you can find for yourself both examples and warnings, fine things to take as models, base things to avoid. The fine things he shows us, at least in the volume before us, and which are always nearest to his heart, are the stern virtues of the infant republic, embodied in a splendid gallery of portraits and a series of tales which the imagination of posterity continues to treasure. I do honestly believe, he writes, that no country has ever been greater or purer than ours, or richer in good citizens and noble deeds. None has been free for so many generations from the vices of avarice and luxury. Nowhere have thrift and plain living been for so long held in such esteem. And he goes on to lament the degeneracy of the modern world, inviting his readers to watch first the sinking of the foundations of morality, as the old teaching was allowed to lapse, then the rapidly increasing disintegration, then the final collapse of the whole edifice, and the dark dawning of our modern day, when we can neither endure our vices nor face the remedies needed to cure them. It is a solemn invitation, but most people enjoy being collectively scolded for their wickedness, and Livy's contemporaries accepted it with ardor. One of the minor pleasures of a modern reader who reads this book will be the pleasure of finding in the context a number of stories with which he is familiar, whether he knows much or little of classical literature. That, for instance, of Numa and his nymph, Egeria, a story which contains a shrewder comment than Livy was aware of on the practicalness of Roman official religion, and perhaps upon the practical aspect of religion in general. Coriolanus, and of Horatius, who kept the bridge, of Tarquin and Lucretia, and Mucius Scaevola, who thrust his right hand into the fire, of Virginia and the wicked Appius, of Cincinnatus, called from the 3-acre farm to save a Roman army from annihilation, and 50 others. They are all beautifully told, briefly, as the classical manner is, and with strong dramatic effect. Scenes, too, live in the memory, such as the fire battle of Fidenae, or the storming of Veii after the 10-year siege, or the Roman nobleman calmly awaiting death when Brennus the Gaul marched in with his barbarian horde. Admirable, too, is the long unfinished tale, running through the greater part of this volume, of the struggle for political power between the privileged and unprivileged orders. The account, from the point of view of sober history, may be oversimplified, but the perennial truth of what was at stake, and is still at stake in the modern world, lives in Livy's pages, packed as they are with incident and character, the rages, ruses, sharp practice, and mutual blackguarding of the opposing leaders, their burst of open violence, and inevitably unanimity whenever news comes that a foreign enemy is on the march for Rome. One word about the speeches. So-and-so mounted the rostrum and spoke as follows. Well, we may be pretty certain that so-and-so did nothing of the kind. There was an eminent lack of shorthand reporters in the ancient world, as of others' devices for the awful exactitudes of today, of cloaks, for instance. The 4th watch was a near enough indication of 0 hour, and commanders-in-chief, bound upon some mighty enterprise, found it sufficient to order the troops to parade at dawn. Livy's reported speeches are, then, so far as their actual words go, pure invention. In the use of them, he was following the common practice of an ancient historians, and the practice is a good one. It is simply a device for expressing vividly and dramatically the ideas and feelings which underlie and originate action, and are as much a part of history as are the actions themselves. Aubrey de Selincourt.